So you're fasted. Everyone wants to know the biochemistry of what happens, right? Sure. So when there's decreasing blood glucose and we haven't been eating, what happens? Well, we release these two hormones. One's called glucagon. Glucose is gone, so we release glucagon and cortisol, which is a stress hormone from our adrenal cortex. So these two hormones will make sure we don't go hypoglycemic. How do they do that? They act on the liver. This is my liver here. And they tell the liver, hey, we need to get glucose into the blood. So one thing we can do, we can break down stored carbohydrate. This is called glycogen. We've stored this from previous carbohydrates we have intaken, and we break that down through glycogenolysis, big fancy word to get glucose. We're just freeing up the glycogen, dumping glucose into the blood. The other thing we can do is this real big word, gluconeogenesis. This is when we take non-carbohydrate products and turn them into glucose. Read the word, glucose, neo, new, genesis, creation. Read it backwards, creation of new glucose. We really rely on this when we have low glycogen stores in the liver, so we've been in a carbohydrate restricted diet, or when we've been fasted a really long time and glycogen's running out. So we use this process even if you are in a fed state, but you're on a zero carbohydrate diet. So we either take the protein you're intaking from your diet if you're eating protein, or if you're fasted, well, we can get a lot of this protein from muscles, especially if you have big skeletal muscles, big muscles on your body. You can break down those proteins, get the amino acids, shuttle them to the liver, put them through gluconeogenesis to create glucose in the blood. Okay, that's how we increase blood glucose. Now, what about the other macronutrients? And what else happens in other tissues? We break down fat, right? If you don't eat, you're going to break down fat. So we break down these things called triglycerides. We store fat as these things called triglycerides. It's a glycerol molecule bound to three fatty acids. We go through this process called lipolysis. That's breaking triglycerides down and dumping these fatty acids, so these free fatty acids, into the blood. That's another fuel source. And then we have this other thing to make it even more complicated. Some of those fatty acids can get shuttled to the liver, go through this process of ketogenesis, where genesis, creation of ketones, and we dump ketones into the blood. So now we have three fuel sources. We've got glucose, we got fatty acids, we got ketones. Different tissues like different fuel sources. The brain cannot use fatty acids, it likes glucose. It can also use ketones if needed. So that's called metabolic flexibility. So lastly, what happens with insulin here? I'm showing insulin. Why is insulin there? We're not eating. We don't need insulin. We do need insulin all the time. Your pancreas is releasing insulin 24/7. Do we need a big amount of insulin? We should not. If everything's healthy and working properly, we don't have insulin resistance, and we have a functioning pancreas. Because to get glucose into the cell, we got to get in the cell to make it useful for energy, making ATP. Well, insulin is the key. Insulin receptors, the lock, and this green thing I drew awfully is called the glucose transporter, the GLUT, G-L-U-T, the glucose transporter. So to get glucose into the cell, we have to have insulin. So in type 1 diabetics who don't make any insulin, well, guess what? Glucose is in the blood, insulin doesn't show up, we can't get glucose into the cells, and then glucose builds up in the blood, leading to hyperglycemia. And this is why type 1 diabetics can have high blood glucose even if they don't eat any food. Okay, so this is how we get glucose into the cell. We need to have release of insulin, not a huge amount of insulin, but just enough to get the glucose we're releasing in the blood into the cell. So three fuel sources: glucose, ketones, fatty acids. They're entering the cell. They go through all these complicated things, and here we wind up with energy for the cell. This is what happens when you're in a fasted state.